My approach is a little different. I'm not really up here to teach you. I'm here to facilitate a discussion, so I'm counting on your participation. If you have an idea, if you have an answer, if you disagree with something, please don't hesitate to say what you have to say. I want to start off the discussion today with a question. What is an outcast? Just a couple of hands. What do you think in your own words? What is an outcast? Sam.
Rejected by society.
Okay, rejected by society. Anybody else?
An individual who's cast out of a group based on their personal beliefs and thoughts.
Okay, an individual who's cast out of the group based on their personal beliefs. Those two are good. Anybody else in the back?
An individual who doesn't fit in with the norm of society as perceived by society.
Okay. I like all the answers. I kind of latched onto yours because you used the word that I used. And I scribbled down, someone who doesn't fit the agreed upon norms. Now, what are some of those norms? We're speaking generally now. What are some norms that people don't fit into that could cause them to be considered outcast? Physical appearance. Anything else? Education, all right? So we can do physical norms, educational norms, social norms. Different views, okay? Over here. Illness, okay, all right. Physical handicap, right? Okay,
If someone doesn't speak the same way as you do,
okay,
has a different accent.
okay, all right. So we got an idea of the different examples of the norms that can cause people to kind of be marginalized and kind of pushed to the edge. So the next question is, who determines what these norms are? Somebody said society, but let's get a little more specific. What parts of society? What are the different groups that can determine what these norms are?
The majority in a given region.
Okay, the majority, all right?
I say whatever your environment is. I say whatever your environment is. It could be small, it could be large, but my environment may be 20 people in my workplace. That's the norm.
Okay, so the context can determine the norm, sure?
I would say the movers and shakers of the world, because it could be just a handful of people who say that you should wear this type of glasses and everyone goes and buys them.
Absolutely, so people of influence, all right? And that's what I have on my notes as well, so, oh, we have one more hand here.
People of religious orientations.
Right, okay, all right. So, within the context of today's lesson, what type of outcasts are we discussing today? Anybody? Are we talking about financial outcasts? No. Garfield.
The lesson broke it down into three categories. There are people who are thrown out because of their behavior, so behavioral outcasts, sociologically, and those who had moral issues.
Okay.
And so those three aspects were brought out.
Okay. I would say, if you all were asking me, that we were discussing spiritual outcasts, right? And of course, spiritual branches out into all different kinds of ways. Your financial decisions are based upon your spirituality. Your social decisions are based upon your spirituality. So I think we get the point. So ultimately, we're talking about spiritual outcasts, and we might even want to say specifically religious outcasts, because that's the context of the lesson. So if we're talking about spiritual or religious outcasts, what are the criteria specifically that determines whether you are considered, and we're going to start with the day of Jesus, but we're going to kind of make it come back to our day because this is what we deal with now. What were some of the criteria that made people considered religious or spiritual outcasts in Jesus' day? I heard behavior earlier. Garfield mentioned morality. Is there anything else? That hand? One time with the mic. All right.
whether or not you were Jewish.
Okay.
I was just reading from the lesson, and it said the lepers and tax collectors.
Okay. All right. And one more hand over here. Sure.
Even if you were Jewish, if you did not abide by the rules and regulations of Abraham's, the scribes and the Pharisees, you were considered an outcast.
Considered an outcast. Who were the? Oh, I'm sorry. One more hand in the back.
Being a woman.
Okay. Gender as well. All right. Vic, we got Vicky. Zami right here.
I mean, the lesson points out that they said publicans and sinners, and the sinners was a catch-all essentially for anyone who had a sin that was more visible than your sin.
That's a fantastic point, which kind of leads into what we're going to talk about later. But so, who were the individuals who were enforcing this manifestation of whether or not people were outcast? Who were the movers and the shakers, the influence peddlers who could enforce this kind of thing? I have the leaders of the church over here in the back. Jacob. Okay.
Again, I'm not going to comment on that right now, but I'm just going to throw that as religious leaders, we have to be very careful, because in Jesus' day, it was those very people who were supposed to look for the Messiah that condemned him. And they didn't even know when the Messiah came.
Thank you, Jacob. Jacob made a point. He says the religious leaders of the day, and then he touched on a contemporary issue where we have a lot of disfellowship. And then Uzama talked about individuals whose dysfunction, their spiritual dysfunction, was much more manifest than other people, or more readily manifested. Garfield.
Yeah, nobody said religious leader, but I take a more responsible account to when I say religious leader. It was those people that God had chosen to be caretakers of people who were, in bad situations. And it's funny how they move from caretakers from the earlier prophets to proclaiming God's word of salvation and redemption to now taking those very same words and beating the people with it. And so, I can't look at just pastors or elders, but as church members, what are our responsibilities as religious leaders in the community that we live in?
Okay, great point. Thank you for that. That leads, I want to pause where we are right now, and I want to introduce something else into the conversation that's relevant. I want to ask you to define a word for me. The word is facade. Does anyone want to try to define that word? Facade, F-A-C-A-D-E, facade. Yes. Sam.
It's the front of a building, what you see from the street that doesn't necessarily reflect the rest of the building.
Okay, all right. Anybody else?
It's a false pretense, pretending to be something that you're not.
Okay. All right. And in the back?
I would say a facade is a cover-up.
A cover-up. Okay, all right. I wrote down the definition of facade. And A, it's the front of a building, especially an imposing or decorative building. B, any side of a building that faces the public. And C, a superficial appearance or an illusion. Okay? Now, I think most of us have used that word facade. I think we understand it in the way that the sister gave the definition. Is that, okay, that's a facade. And we tend to think of it as being fake. But primarily, facade means that which the public sees, the way Sam discussed. It doesn't necessarily reflect what's behind the front. It's just what's in the front. Now, the reason I introduced this word facade is because I think that it's woven into how people get marginalized and become outcasts. Because if, as Cherie said, the dominant or the influential group, and like Tony pointed out, it doesn't have to be a large group. It could be 20 people, right? If this influential group now can determine what the criteria is for how people are judged and evaluated, right? We all are aware of what's going on, right? When we come to CPC to worship every Sabbath, do we wear jeans or sweats? No, because we understand what is an acceptable form of dress when we come to worship, right? Is God less accepting of our worship if we came in Bermuda shorts? No, but we understand socially as we interact with one another, there's certain things that are acceptable. Now, I'm not knocking how we dress, but I'm saying this is how people function. We sort of pick up on what is acceptable, right? We do it with dress, we do it with finances, we do it socially, right? We do it with who we date. You all get the picture, right? So now when it comes to spirituality, right, and this is why you find that if you go to a particular church, the worship style is one way. You go to another church, same denomination, the worship style is another way, because everybody seems to understand and sort of understand, this is how things are working here. So now we go back to outcasts. You have people that are considered outcasts, all right? And I'm curious because I want to ask the question, what is the norm of God's creation? And when I say God's creation, I don't just mean planet Earth. I mean all of the quote-unquote unfallen worlds. What is the spiritual norm for the rest of God's creation? Let's say socially.
First word that comes to mind is harmony.
Harmony. Okay, any other words? Doesn't have to be socially. Any other context you can think of. Think of what is the norm for the rest of God's creation. We have harmony. Sure.
When you repeated, the second word that came to mind was love.
Love.
Love was the second thing that came to my mind.
Okay, we have harmony, we have love.
Still in the same context, I was going to say love but peace.
Peace. Okay, harmony, love, and peace. Those are really great words. Frank.
Diversity.
Diversity. Okay, which also goes hand in hand with harmony. Okay, anybody else? In the back. Oh, sorry. Oh, okay.
I thought of no condemnation.
Okay.
I think of equality.
Equality. All right. You have another one, Tony? One more in the back.
Compassion.
Compassion. All right. One more. Just shout it out. Worship. Okay. I think we got enough adjectives now, right? So if this is the norm, these different adjectives that we've described, these are definitions or descriptions of what the norm is in God's creation. Is that the norm for the planet, our planet? No, it's not. So if we have decided that the influential group, the majority group, determines the norm, are we outcasts? The entire planet, all of us are outcasts. So I find it interesting now, so when we go back into the lesson, it seems tragically ironic now that you have individuals on a planet where we're all outcasts, and yet we have the audacity to marginalize other people. Right? Over here.
I think the better question is in whose view are you talking about as outcasts? Because if you're looking at the view of human beings,
right,
I guess, all of us are outcasts. But in the sight of God, there's a different standard.
Right. And that's a great question. So I would ask you, whose view matters?
Easy, God.
God's view matters. So that's the view we're talking about.
I like this conversation. I think I completely agree that God's view matters. I think the challenge is that often we confuse what God's view is, and I think that's what the power of this lesson was, because it really illustrated, and it illustrated to me, frankly, that so often our views are inconsistent with the way Jesus lived and walked and talked and behaved with people. And if you are dealing with someone that you see every day coming out of the metro who is clearly mentally ill, I think this lesson challenges us all to say, how are we going to interact with these people differently next time?
Right. Sure.
I dare not to say that our view matters. Because unless our view is in tune with Christ, my view can affect your behavior.
Right.
My view can affect not only your behavior, but your salvation, as well as my own. So even though the overall arching perspective is God's view that matters, ultimately on this planet, my view matters. Because if I have a particular perspective on some particular issue, whether it's spiritual or whether it's secular, I can influence you to either accept my views or reject my views. But either way, in some portion, I am controlling your thought.
Jacob.
The irony of the whole thing is we are not consistent. I mean, for years, if you talk about pot, it was a crime to smoke pot. Today, you can go and you can buy pot literally in many states, either as medicine or, for use. And in the church, growing up in the church, growing up in Africa, it was like anathema to hear any music except for the piano. But now we accept all other music. So our views change. That's why the only view that matters is God's view. Because we can change, we are biased. I can come here and you can say I have an accent. If I go to Freetown, I don't have an accent. So human beings change. So God's view is the only view that really matters because we change.
Okay. All right. Now we've defined an outcast. We've defined facade. The question I want to throw out to everybody is, why do you need a facade? Why does someone? I'm sorry. One more comment over here.
Just want to go back to your description of facade. What's interesting is that in this society, the people who excel, quote unquote, excel or succeed by the earthly standards are those who figure out a way to master being a facade. Right. When I go to an interview, I don't reveal my best self that God knows or my spouse knows or my kid knows. I am mastering what it is that they need and want to hear for me to be a successful candidate for this position. So the people who get into politics and people who run government and people who run institutions and people who are pulling levers are those individuals who've largely figured out a way to master or game the system, which means putting up, as Sam said correctly, that front of the building. And it's not about the depthness. It's not about, how deep you really are into God or into your children or into the principles that ultimately matter. It's about how well you are at being a facade.
Right. Excellent, beautiful. Which leads me to the next question, is what is the purpose? Why does anybody need to manufacture a facade? Why would you need to do that?
Sometimes it's for protection.
Okay.
Self-protection. When we were, I remember when we took my son in for his second year checkup, and I said, gee, he's really a friendly, outgoing kid. Is that going to change? Am I, when I turn around and he's a teenager, is he going to be mopey and everything else? And the doctor said, no, that's really the way he is. People, when you see them as children, that is the way they are. It's only as they grow that they develop different personalities or different aspects of their personalities in the world to protect themselves. And so I think that developing a facade in some cases is very human.
So for protection, Sam?
I believe we have more than one, to go back to what the elder said. And some of our facades are unconscious. When I have this microphone in my mouth, I speak a certain way. When I go back home to Petersburg and I'm hanging out with the guys I grew up with, I speak an entirely different way. Right. I just fall into it. It's not something that I think about. My speech patterns change. I use different words. Everything changes. Hank knows all about that. He's from down that way. So, from a spiritual standpoint, that's why it's so important to surrender yourself to the Holy Spirit. Because we do so much based on our sinful natures. That's the facade or facades, because I believe there are multiple, whether you're on an interview or with your family or whatever. Surrendering yourself to the Holy Spirit is the only facade that we need to focus on, really.
I think that some people put on facades to be accepted as a norm. You ever heard of the phrase, doing like the Joneses do? A lot of times people try to keep up with the Joneses.
Okay. Oh, in the back.
Sometimes people keep a facade for the sake of power. And we see this from the lessons to the religious establishment, where their facade and their pretense was to maintain a dominance over the people, showing themselves to be religious. And many times individuals who see themselves as the one who are maintaining the standards or keeping the standards, they're the one who feel the right to impose these restrictions and regulation and ways of living upon others because it's a play for power.
Garfield.
And I like what my brother just said back there, Greg. You know, for all of us who might put on a facade, I think at some degree it exposed a level of inadequacy in us that we don't want people to see. There's this weakness or some kind of a vulnerability. And so we have to put on this cocoon to make ourselves look like we are more important, not necessarily just like anybody, but we're important. And if we would just reveal that vulnerability, because I mean, I sit here and I heard many sermons, and if we don't, God will expose us. At some point along our lives, we're going to be exposed. And so we want to walk around with these facades so that, as some people say, acceptable protection. But I call it the biggest deception, because people are not really seeing who we really are. And can I really be a lover of you if I don't know who you are, if you're putting on a facade? I don't know who you are if you're putting on a facade. So, you know, when we move away from these kind of things and the shells are broken, then, you know, God can truly work upon our hearts. He's trying to remove that external so he can get to that weak, vulnerable part inside of us.
Fantastic. Oh, actually, never mind. No? Yes?
I'm sorry, it looked like I was interrupting your thought there. I just wanted to pose a question, because there's this discussion in Thursday's lesson that talks about how Christ was roundly criticized for the people he spent time with. And I'm just trying to make that real to 2014. I mean, we're talking prostitutes now. And I'm trying to imagine if the report came back that Elder Onije was having dinner on Thursday night with some prostitutes. Now, I think that points out the difference between his approach and our approach. And I'm just curious as to, are there people in our society that we shouldn't spend time with outside of church?
That's where I was actually headed. I'll come right to you, but two words I heard: acceptance, I heard protection, actually 3 words, and I heard inadequacy. And before I address that, what's really interesting is, have any of us ever seen a building where the front or the facade is glass, right? They're really nice, right? Why is the front glass? Because obviously the architect or the people who have the building, they're not concerned with what people see on the inside. So the front of the facade is transparent. You understand? And so many of us put up a facade that's not transparent because we're uncomfortable about what's behind the front. Okay, so this is what we're dealing with. So going back to Uzama's question, is Jesus dealing with who he dealt with? Some of us don't want to be in certain situations because we understand that if we're seen with a particular person, there's going to be an association there. And we don't want that association made. So we don't associate with certain people, or we don't say certain things, or we don't do certain things, or go do whatever it is that we actually are inspired to do by God because we're uncomfortable. So I think, getting back to Osama's point, what's interesting is that the question I want to ask now is that why did Jesus, because since we're talking about the lesson of him and Outcasts, why was he drawn to Outcasts? Seemingly he bypassed people who had these manufactured facades and went straight to people who were the most obviously broken. We got a hand over here and a hand over here.
I think one of the reasons why he went to Outcasts is because an outcast has to realize who they are and where they are, whereas somebody with a facade is trying to be somebody different. And it's kind of hard to work with somebody that's always trying to make you believe somebody that they are rather than letting you see who they really are. You know, God comes to you as you are. And if you're trying to put a facade, you're not trying to let the healer see that person. So that's why I think he went to Outcasts.
I think there's another hand in the back.
I think Jesus, more than anybody, knew what was inside of people. And so when he sees a Pharisee or a rabbi putting on their exterior appearance of righteousness and caring, what better way to shatter that than to go and minister to the people that they say they care for but don't really care for? So they wouldn't go near a leper. They wouldn't go near a prostitute, even though they said that they were righteous or projected righteousness and caring. They didn't really care. And so Jesus went to care for those people and shatter their facade.
Hand in the back, Tony, and then Sheree.
One of the things we see with Jesus is that, as the brother rightly said, he bypassed many of the elite because, as the brother previously mentioned, a person who puts on a facade is an individual who, for the most part, is driven by pride and haughtiness. And in the Word of God, we found that that's not the Spirit of God, and he struggled to meet such people. Such an individual would be in either self-denial or not see their need at all. And he struggled to meet such people because when you put on that facade, you're trying to tell people on the outside that you're okay. And you reach the point where you yourself start to believe that lie. You deceive your own self, thinking that you're rich, you're full of goods, and you have no need of anything. So Christ would go to those who saw their need and whose needs were not being fulfilled by those who claimed to be their caregivers.
I want to touch on it real quick before I go to Tony. You know, I was scribbling notes in here, and when I was going through this lesson, I said to myself, well, let me go through this and see what applies to me and what I can use. And one of the things I scribbled on in my notes is that the people, I believe, the outcasts, are individuals, since we're using the analogy of facades, are people who don't have the means to create. They don't have the spiritual mortar, the spiritual brick, or the spiritual paint to create a facade. So they're just like, whatever, I give up, right? So it's not that they don't care. Some of these people are filled with shame, but if they could, they would build a facade, but they can't. So now they're obviously, like Osama was talking about earlier, you know, these are people who are obviously, quote unquote, in sin. And I think what we need to understand is that when people are broken, they do broken things. So we're looking at people based on their behavior. Jesus saw their brokenness. We see the behavior that offends us. Okay? And so this is, once to your point, this is why he went and did what he did. And I think it would behoove us, first of all, to understand our own brokenness. Right? And because my brokenness is not manifested in as relatively as bad way as yours is, I don't need to be thinking about myself in a particular way. All right, Tony.
My response is very similar to what he said, that he went to them because his people had lived a facade for so long that they believed it, that they have become not just a facade, but a building that he had to break into. So instead of going that route, he went to the people, like he said, that were open to that. He went to the low, the hungry, the broken, those people who were wanting and willing to accept him. Even the people who, quote unquote, were rich, the tax collectors, the Republicans, et cetera, et cetera. But they knew that they needed more.
First, I want to go
Republicans.
back to what Usama mentioned regarding the prostitutes on a Thursday night. Hopefully, you're giving them legal counsel. And then secondly, with the gentleman in the back with respect to the facade, I think that most people have that because they're hurt. I believe that most people put up that facade because they don't want to get hurt again. So they build up these walls. And then the third thing is Jesus did what he did because he just loves people. His norm is love. He doesn't see anything any different in that. Last Saturday night, I went to a party. Had a good time, knowing there were going to be drinkers there, smokers there, spade playing, having a good time, dropping the F-bomb. I knew it was going to happen. But that didn't hinder me from going to the party because I knew going, I was still going to have fun. I was still going to sit amongst a group of people that I can enjoy and be a witness to, and also show that I don't have to drink to have fun. I don't have to smoke to have fun, but I did want to play some spades. Anywho, the point is that I'm saying all that to say I get into a conversation. Before I know it, I'm witnessing to somebody about our health life, our diet, our religion, why we do what we do and don't do what we do. She wants to know how to get to the Book and Bible House, contacted me and had the neighbor or the friend contact me this week to find out more information. God does what he does just because he loves people.
And in the back over here. There.
I just wanted to read something from the lesson that I just got a lot from. It says, Jesus wasted no effort damaging the outcast's already diminished sense of self-worth. Instead, he created a renewed sense of personal value. And I got to tell you, that really challenged me. I just said, if there is someone who, in my view, doesn't fit the norm, is that my approach? Am I going to waste effort already trying to beat them down when they're already beaten down? Or am I going to try to uplift them? And I'll tell you, I'll just be honest, because sometimes we just want to talk around issues, and I don't like to do that particularly. I have heard some of the most hateful things come out of Christians' mouths when it comes to homosexuals. That wasn't Christ's approach. You can't beat someone up and then think you're going to give him the love of God. You can't do that. And we really have to focus on if our standard is inconsistent with his. And I know I've heard all the arguments. It's an abomination. Well, guess what? The Bible says that a haughty look is abomination. I don't hear anyone walking around talking about that the way they talk about homosexuality. We need to get a grip and realize that God's standard is so much higher than our own. And he's really pointing out to us, this is what I want you to do. And we can be like the religious folks of Christ's day who essentially rejected that, or we can be like the ones who were trodden down and say, yeah, I got a lot more that I need to accomplish.
Gwen, then Garfield.
I was going to say, I think that people that we consider the downtrodden, they recognize who they are. The thief said, I'm a thief on the cross. I did it. Other people steal every day, and they say, well, they had a surplus. But on the other hand, we look at situations where we don't even expose people to the truth. So if Christ is saying, we have all of this stuff here, we can quote the Bible and all that, we get lots of it. Some of us still will reject it. They didn't even offer that to those people. They're not even exposed. So at least Christ gave them the opportunity to have a chance to understand what was going on as far as salvation. And we don't even offer to those because we don't touch them.
I want to make a quick comment before we go to Garfield and the other brother, because we only got 5 minutes left.
Yeah, I often hear us.
1 second. I want to ask a quick question. You can give your comment, but just to get it out there, because of the few minutes we have left. Did Jesus think that he was doing something cutting edge by going to these people? Because I want to ask the question because of something Cherie said earlier. Because a lot of us, if Uzama was out giving legal counsel to a prostitute, or some of us had gone to some place where we wouldn't normally go or feel comfortable witnessing. Hopefully not, but in some cases, you know, we'd feel good. I went in the mud and I witnessed for the Lord. And there's a sense of, you know, we want to pop your collar a little bit. But did Jesus feel like that? Did he think he was doing something extraordinary by going to these people? All right, Garfield. Yeah. And then whoever wants to answer that question afterwards.
We often say never kick a man or a woman while he or she is down. When people are hurting, they're truly hurting, and you can't tell them that they're not hurting. For those folks who, in Christ's time, whether it's a prostitute or whatever, maybe throughout their lives they had a facade, that shell. But after a while, can you contain hurt for too long? That facade is going to crack, right? It's in my Bible, it says in Isaiah 57:15, says, "For thus saith the high and lofty one, that inhabiteth eternity, whose name is holy. I dwell in the high and holy place with him also that is of a contrite and humble spirit, and to revive the spirit of the humble, and to revive the heart of the contrite ones." Some Bible translation says broken. Broken. And we have to come before God broken. We have to expose ourselves. Many of us here, we put on the facade, but a lot of us inside are broken. I can tell you without any shame, I'm a broken man. I've been out in the world and things that happened to me throughout my life, and I realized if it wasn't for Christ, coming back to church, I would not have known what it felt like to be broken and now to be renewed by his grace.
How much time? 2 minutes? 1 minute. Okay, go ahead, brother.
Just to add to what the brother said, and this I think is one of the major force of the lesson of why Christ was able to reach the social outcasts, is because he understood what his mission was, and he had that relationship with the Father. And unless we come to that point where we are experiencing the grace of Christ, then we will not be in a state or position to help those who are down, because a person who has that facade never sees the need for that grace. So they never experience the grace. They don't know what it is to be lifted up, to moved out of the gutter or out of the slums. They don't know that. So in essence, they look down on other people. So unless you come to Christ broken and experiences that grace, then you're going to be of more harm to the outcast than a helper.
Amen. Beautiful. Our time is up. I thank you so much for your participation. I just wanted to add one more thing to what the brother said. I think is that when it comes to Jesus and him going to the outcasts, I think a lot of us are not as concerned with giving because we're still getting. And we come to church to get. And that's nothing wrong with that. God is always giving. But I think, to reiterate the brother's point, is that I think in order for us to do the things that Jesus did, we have to be whole. A quick analogy, if you had a lottery ticket and you saw the numbers and it was your ticket, would you wait to be happy? No, you would know right then. You'd be rejoicing with the ticket in your hand and you don't have a stitch of cash in the bank. And I think the analogy is that we need to understand that the opportunity for us to be whole comes along with us being born again and accepting Christ. So you don't have to have the money in the bank yet. You have the knowledge that it's coming. And so if we have the knowledge that wholeness is coming, then we can start focusing on what we can give to other people. Okay? Amen.